The fact is then that microplastics inhibit photosynthesis. So that's the whole basis of all life on Earth. We environmentalists used to say all food is grass because everything comes and everything, particularly us human beings, depends on the success of photosynthesis. So this is really, really, really scary because, as you've already mentioned, they're everywhere in our brains, absolutely everywhere.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmens, the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, and I'll be the host today for another important discussion on yet a dimension of the climate crisis that is beginning to get more attention, and that is in its own right a crisis, and that's plastics there. And we're calling our program today Plastic Planet Climate Chaos. We'll be looking at both the harms of plastics in general and more specifically microplastics, the incredible harm and the pervasiveness of that harm, but also their interrelationships with the climate crisis. And some of you of a certain age, or if you're movie buffs, may well remember the well-known movie from way back in 1967 called The Graduate, starring Dustin Hoffman. For some reason, there was one scene, one very short scene of just a few seconds that seemed to capture not only the zeitgeist of the movie, but the zeitgeist of a whole era. And that was when a Mr. McGuire, who was a friend of Ben Braddock, played by Dustin Hoffman's parents, at a party, basically, sort of put his arm around Dustin and sort of asked him to come into the other room quietly, like a kind old uncle, and look down on him because he was, sort of taller than Dustin. And he said to him, he said, and this is again away from everybody else, he said, I just want to say one word to you. Just one word. Plastics. And Dustin looked at him with a certain amount of sort of questioning and said, yes, sir. And then he said, are you listening? There is a great future in plastics. Well, as it turns out, there has been a future in plastics. It affects everything we do and almost everything we use. Whether that's been a great future or not remains to be seen, and we'll discuss it today. And of course, we'll be spending many more than just one word on plastics, and in particular on microplastics. And when I was preparing for today's session, I came across a statistic, like many of the climate and ecological statistics that just amaze us today, that on average, something like 125 pounds of plastic are produced each and every year for every person on the planet or so. And something like 95% of the particles, because they're so small, are microplastics. And about 20% of the weight of the plastics turns out to be microplastics. And of course, they're everywhere. So with that as a kind of introduction, I'm happy as always to introduce our panelists, our longtime participants at the Climate Emergency Forum. Dr. Peter Carter first. Peter in British Columbia is a retired medical doctor, the founder of the Climate Emergency Institute, an expert reviewer for the IPCC, and a longtime advocate for looking at all of the adverse and other impacts between health and climate, of which plastics is certainly one of them. Peter, so happy to have you here today, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Herb. And thanks for reminding us about that great film, The Graduate. Yeah, I'd completely forgotten that bit. So I'll have to admit that I really only started sort of researching microplastics very recently. I've been very lax and behind the curve when it comes to this particular potentially catastrophic situation all of its own. However, I could give you my talk in 5 words. and that would be phase out fossil fuels fast. So there you are. That's the most important thing. That's everything because plastics are derived from the fossil fuel industry. They're made starting with oil and natural gas, and then they're put through all kinds of brilliant chemical processes. And at the end, we have the various kinds of plastic. The effect of microplastics, it hit the environmental headlines, let's say that, with a paper that was recently published, which warned in no uncertain terms that microplastics were going to damage our crops and further compromise our crop yields and food security. So all of a sudden, I found that pretty stunning because we're having a sort of drag back on our crop yield productions. And I should mention here that recently the FAO publication is an annual publication on their statistics that came out just a month ago or so. Since 2015, the wonderful increase in our crop production has stopped increasing. It's very clear that we're having damage to our crop yields due to climate change and most likely extreme weather events, of course. Well, the fact is then that microplastics inhibit photosynthesis. So that's the whole basis of all life on Earth. We environmentalists used to say all food is grass because everything comes and everything, particularly us human beings, depends on the success of photosynthesis. So this is really, really, really scary because, as you've already mentioned, they're everywhere in our brains, absolutely everywhere. The smaller they are, as I think you inferred, the more dangerous they become. And in fact, some sort of friendly microorganisms are able to break up microplastics, but then they're even more dangerous. They make up about the latest figure I could find was a recent paper 4.5% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that is huge. That's absolutely huge. Global plastic production is increasing and projected. No, it's increasing up to 2020 at an exponential rate. So, with regards to greenhouse gas emissions, I discovered that right the way through the life cycle of making plastics, we have emissions of CO2, but also methane. The majority is carbon dioxide, supposedly, but from the literature and the chemistry, it looks to me like methane is going to increase in its emissions from plastics in general. Microplastics, they inhibit photosynthesis, they compromise plant and therefore crop yield, and they do that at every part of the plant development. So the big thing about microplastics is they're ubiquitous, they are forever, they're universal, and they have multi-toxic effects, including emission of persistent organic pollutants. As one paper said, potentially on this microplastics, potentially the combination of microplastic pollution and fossil fuel greenhouse gas pollution is a planet catastrophic risk at the very least. So I'll finish up and say again, if we want to have any kind of life in the future, we have to be calling over and over and over, particularly at this stage in our international life, for the rapid phase out of fossil fuel. Emissions had to go into decline by this year, as it is.
Thank you for your always direct and sobering reminders to us of what we're facing. There's no question that I think all of us recognize, and most, if not all of our viewers, the absolute need to decarbonize and eliminate fossil fuel combustion from the planet as quickly as humanly possible for all the reasons that we've been discussing and many others have been discussing for years and years. One of the challenges, of course, is that not only are the microplastics and the plastic consequences of what we produce everywhere, but the actual products that plastic is a part of are everywhere. Everything we use almost has a plastic component. And I suspect that if we eliminated plastics tomorrow, we wouldn't be able to be communicating with each other right now because of the components that are in our laptops and our computers and in the wires and everything else that connects us. And if we look at our kitchens and our desks and whatever, even the things that we obviously recognize as plastics are in the dozens, if not the hundreds, in our own households. And I at least have seen very little evidence that either governments or private industry are, on an urgent emergency basis investigating alternative materials and processes so that we can get the hell out of the plastics world and still have the benefits that many of these products provide for us. And with that, as always, I'm really happy to introduce Paul Beckwith. Paul is a climate systems scientist who lives in Ottawa and has produced probably more videos on the climate crisis and every aspect of it than anybody on this planet, and continues to do so week after week and week after week. Paul, as always, it's a pleasure, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Herb, and thank you, Peter. So, Herb mentioned on a per capita, per person basis that we produce about 125 pounds of plastic per person per year. According to the World in Data, plastic production has doubled roughly in the last 20 years alone. So, the production is accelerating rapidly. When we talk about microplastics, I mean, a micron is 10 to the minus 6 meters. So, you pretty much need a microscope to see it. Human hair might be between 50 and 150 microns, depending on how thick your hair is, just to give you an idea of scale. When we talk about microplastics, they actually can be vary in range from the nanometer scale to 5 millimeters or so. 1 nanometer is 10 to the ninth meters, which is 1/1000th of a micron. So these are the very, very tiny plastic particles that can easily get into the human body and plants and disrupt, biological systems. Because of the nature of plastics in the environment, abrasion and wear and tear, it breaks the larger chunks into smaller chunks and then the smaller ones into even more smaller chunks. So the number of plastic particles at each different spatial scale can increase exponentially. So you get kind of like a cascading increase in the number of small nanometer sized plastics. Now, scientists did a study with mice. They put microplastics in the water in the mice, and and then analyzed where it went in the body of the mice. And within about 3 weeks, it went into the brain, which is a big, huge surprise to them because these plastics were so tiny that they were able to pass the blood-brain barrier, and they caused noticeable cognitive decline in the mice, almost looking like dementia. If we look at what we eat, plastic, you can find plastic in pretty much everything. Peter was mentioning how ubiquitous they are, these plastic particles. So, for example, in fruits and vegetables, abrading off plastic water bottles in the air, in cosmetics and household dust, even in things like, breast milk, the placenta, in a pregnant woman. Testicles, they've lots of plastics in testicles. So therefore in sperm and in, other parts of the male reproductive organ, that should wake some people up if they think, well, why do we need to be worried about plastics? Heart tissue, livers, kidney, all these things. There are a lot of climate impacts on plastics. So plastics in the ocean getting into phytoplankton and zooplankton, the base of the food chain. When they get into the phytoplankton, they can disrupt photosynthesis and reduce the efficiency of carbon capture. We know that the ocean is an enormous sink of carbon, and that sink is reducing. It probably peaked about 2008 and has been dropping since then. these plastics, when they're in phytoplankton that are then ingested by the small animals, the zooplankton, how does the carbon get to the deep ocean seafloor? Well, these small animals, when they secrete their waste, right? Their waste, the very small fecal pellets and feces, goes down. It's heavier, it's dense, it sinks down to the ocean floor. The problem is if it's laced with microplastics, they're lighter. This material, fecal matter, is not as heavy. It's more buoyant, so much less of it gets to the ocean floor, and it takes a lot longer. So this is a huge issue, a huge threat to the ability of the ocean to be a massive sink for carbon is significantly degraded from these microplastics. So that's just one example. There's many other unintentional consequences. Part of the problem is, plastics are so easy to work with. You can make them clear, you make toys, you make all kinds of different devices out of them. You can change the durability of them, and we make them to last. So we really need to consider cradle to grave, circular economy type thinking for plastics. And many things that are made of plastics can be made of plant-based plastics that degrade very, very quickly compared to standard fossil fuel-based plastics. So we need to really change the way we do things regarding plastics because we're only hurting ourselves.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for, along with Peter, beginning to sort of map out and describe all of the connections, or not all, just the few of the connections between plastics and the climate crisis and plastics and other aspects of life. And what it reminds me of is the critical need for the world, and particularly those countries that have the ability to afford it, to have the sufficient scientific capability and resources to look at this, to go down deep into the oceans, to have what I'm sure are just incredibly specialized laboratories that can examine the tiniest of particles and see their interactions. And so I think most of us are aware that that capability, at least in my country, in the United States, is being threatened and challenged every day. At the same time that we're learning more and more about these just what I call pervasive, pernicious connections that plastic and so many other artificial substances we're just discovering. As you said, we didn't know they'd go into the brain, because maybe the blood-brain barrier was sufficient. And usually the surprises are not good ones. So we need not only to address, well, we need to address this, but the way to do that is basically to have the scientific and technological capability and motivation and resources to examine these very difficult to discover connections, and then, of course, to implement the kind of policy that's necessary to, as Peter said at the very beginning, to eliminate fossil fuels, to transfer our production of plastics into biodegradable forms or using other materials, or in some cases recognize that in the future, maybe we don't need all this stuff that's made out of plastic that's in our homes and our businesses and so forth. That's a radical idea to some folks, but it's one I think we need to explore. And with that, let me turn it back to Peter. Floor is yours.
Yeah, I remember President George Bush famously making a statement that Americans are addicted to oil. Never a truer word than those. It's proving out that we are generally, as a society, as a civilization, totally addicted to fossil fuels. Apparently, we are in love with fossil fuels. We care about fossil fuels more than our children, more than all the life around us. So that results in the fact that the IPCC actually said back in 2018 that we have to have a transformation, making things a little bit better, increasing efficiency, which is what is being talked about with plastics, for example. It's not going to do it. That is not going to rescue our future. We have to have large scale, right across the board, transformation. everything has to be done differently. Everything can be done differently. We know that. The first plastic was an organic plastic made of plant residues, and a brilliant man discovered how to make those into plastic. Plastic you can see through. I can remember when I was a little boy in England, I can remember my father's first little sports car. He had these windows which they had a slight yellow-green tint to them. They were plastic. It's the same old story. We don't need to be having these plastics made from fossil fuels. We can provide for ourselves the same goods and the same services without involving fossil fuels in their production. And that's what we have to do. And we can't be doing anything shorter of that. Now, I think I sort of apologized in a way that I really wasn't on top of the microplastic situation until very recently when this paper came out, which said that microplastics affect crops, damage crops at every level, root to leaves. And that is already, according to the researchers, starting to cut back on our crop yield. And we already have that happening with greenhouse gas pollution on our crop yield. My final point would be that I was aware of the plastics treaty, the UN treaty that was going on for some years, but there's nothing about fossil fuels in the treaty, nothing at all whatsoever. And then when I went to Google and Google in mitigation for plastic, microplastic situation, it took me a long time, seriously, to come across some statements, some articles, some papers that pointed out that the solution is stop fossil fuels. So it's absolutely unbelievable, both on the greenhouse gas, climate change longstanding, and also on this microplastic pollution that somehow we're allowing fossil fuels to stay under the radar.
Thank you, Peter. That's been a common theme of yours and ours. Again, the pernicious and the pervasive impacts of direct and indirect of fossil fuels and the incredible energy density that they provide is what essentially has addicted us and most everybody to them. When you can get into a vehicle and just with a slight touch of your foot, have that vehicle go 100 kilometers an hour or more, 60 miles an hour for my American friends. Like, you say, well, my car has 200 horsepower underneath the hood and well, I have 350. Well, that's not enough. So, well, how can I live a productive, healthy life with only 350 horses powering my trip to the grocery store instead of walking? And yet that's the world we have created for ourselves. And not only have we created it, but we think it's normal. We think that's the only way it should be. That's the only way it can be. That's the only way it must be. How dare you tell me that I can only have 100 horses in my car? How dare you tell me that I have to ride my bike? Or how dare you tell me that I should buy 2 weeks worth of food at one time or grow them in my backyard? We are the most, I'm sorry for my rant, but something you said, Peter, just stimulated that in me. We are the most entitled group of people, understandably. I mean, it's not that we're evil, or some of us maybe, or we're selfish, but we take on the values and the behaviors that surround us and that are perpetuated and reinforced by the media, by the advertisements that we see every day, by what our friends and colleagues say. And the result is, among other evils and ills, is, what some have called the plastification of our society, not just the material, but the kind of, superficial values that plastic seems to represent. So with that, I will conclude my rant and turn it back to Paul, who may want to continue on your own rant or otherwise fill us in some more.
I don't know. It's a hard act to follow that rant, but yeah, we're addicted to oil. We're addicted to plastics. One of the things from an engineering standpoint is that plastics are kind of an ideal material to use and to make. It's very cheap. First of all, depending on additives, you can make it very hard plastics. You can make it soft. You can make it clear. You can make any color plastics you want. So it's extremely versatile. You can put things in it to make it better withstand UV. You heat it up to, just a little bit, and it's a fluid, and you can put it in injection molded things, make objects of any shape, size, dense, make lubricants, you can make plumbing pipes, you can make, Teflon things with all different types of properties. It's ideal, and this is why it's ubiquitous, but not from an environmental standpoint and not from a health standpoint. They affect things, life, plants, animals, they can block passages for fluids, water in the plants and animals that they're in, so they can physically cause problems because of their size and cause blockages and disrupt biological processes. But there's also indirect effects where when the plastics themselves break down, the chemicals coming from the plastics can be, strong disruptors of hormones and endocrine disruptors and things like that, and have huge negative impacts on human health and on crops and plants and animals, that Peter was getting to. So once again, because of all these ideal properties, this is why they're everywhere. And we really need to cut back on all the gadgets and things that people seem to think that they need. There are alternatives to plastic. There's plant-based plastics that can degrade just in a few years compared to decades or even centuries. So, if we're making bottles or something that is, one use sort of thing, then it's disposed of. We want those things to degrade very quickly and not leave all these remnants in the environment that affect people's human health and, the health of ecosystems for centuries to come. So there's lots of things that we can do, and it's really off the radar for many. I don't see it talked about very often with politicians, etc. Part of the reason is it is a fossil fuel product, so it's got the huge weight of money of fossil fuel companies to perpetuate it.
Yes, thanks, Paul. And that I was surprised to see that actually there was a fair amount of legislation around the world about a decade ago to ban sort of the microbeads from cosmetics and soaps and other products like that, that we use and never imagining that we're, washing our faces with plastic and pouring it down the drain and all the rest of that. Now, obviously, that's only a small portion of the problem, and it doesn't deal with what's already in our oceans and our land and in the atmosphere. It's a beginning, but then we seem to have stalled as a society. And before we sort of wrap up, I just wanted to point out my own background is much more in public policy than it is in science. And so I always tend to think about what are the institutions we can create? What are the laws that we can pass to begin to attack these pernicious problems? One of the things that still puzzles and deeply, deeply upsets me is that there were some folks back, I think it was in the 1970s or thereabouts, who came up with the idea in the US Congress of creating what they called the Office of Technology Assessment. It was basically a scientific and policy arm to Congress, staffed by, the brightest, nonpartisan people with the most impeccable backgrounds, to essentially, as the title suggested, to assess new technologies as they were emerging and to advise Congress how beneficial, how dangerous, how they needed to be regulated or not. And it was very effective. They produced any number of really important reports. And then a new Congress, a new political party came in. I won't mention their name, but most of us can probably figure out who they were, and abolished that office several decades ago. And for some reason, it has never been reestablished. I don't know if other countries like Canada or the EU or anywhere in the world have similar organizations who are dedicated on a nonpartisan basis to essentially scan what's happening in the world, assess it, and give the best advice to our decision makers so they can protect us and promote the general welfare. I hope that that is an idea that can reemerge or that exists elsewhere right now. Obviously, if it does exist, it's not doing the job it needs to, or at least its advice is not being followed by everybody. But that's one source of information, I think, that I would urge those of you who are watching to think about advocating to your legislators and your elected officials wherever in the world you may live. And those of you who follow us live all over the world, and we appreciate that. And so I want to, as always, thank so sincerely both Paul and Peter for your thoughtful and scientifically valid and critical comments on this just burgeoning problem of the plastification of our society and with all the implications of that. As always, we ask you to like our video and our channel, to subscribe to our programs, to share this and other programs with your friends and colleagues, to leave your comments and your suggestions for other programs that we could put on, and to go to our website, theclimateemergencyforum.org. Take a look at our videos. We have some blogs, some other information there. And before you leave, don't forget to go to our donate page and help ensure that we can continue to provide you with one of the few sources anywhere that is focused entirely on the climate emergency, what it is, and how we can best address it. And so until next week, have a good week, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much.